Hi, everybody, and welcome to this next interview here on the YouTube channel, where we typically talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologia. But as I have mentioned, I want to branch out, and I have been seeking experts in philosophy, people who have degrees, so I can pick their brain and talk about things even outside Thomistic philosophy. And I got to say, just really, really delighted that my guest on this interview is Dr. Robert Howell, and he serves as the chair of the philosophy department at Southern Methodist University, where I actually graduated with a degree, a bachelor's degree back in 1989 in journalism. It wasn't philosophy, it was journalism and communication. So very, very grateful that you came and spoke with me, Dr. Howell. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So you went to Brown University, Iowa University for your undergraduate in philosophy, and then off to get your PhD at Brown University. So did you know early on in your life that you wanted to do philosophy, or when did that bug hit you?
Well, actually, I knew that I wanted to do some of it fairly early. I thought that I was going to go and study some philosophy, but also study economics, and then make millions of dollars, and then in my waning years, go back to philosophy. And I really enjoyed it in high school, but of course you don't get exposed to a whole lot. Once I was in college, though, I quickly came to realize that I wanted to spend all my time doing philosophy and none of my time doing business. And so, to my father's chagrin, I turned fully towards philosophy. And
he didn't like that, huh?
Actually, he was fine with it. My father and my mother were much more supportive than some. A lot of my students' parents all want to call me and they say, "Don't encourage my child to do philosophy. I want him to actually make some money."
Yeah. So now you're doing well. You're the head of a department. Have they come around and said, "Okay, you made the right decision"?
They're proud of me. At least that's what they say.
Okay. And anything else about yourself as far as I know you have at least one child, you're married, anything else from a personal standpoint?
Yeah, I've got a 9-year-old boy, and I've been married for about 15 years now. I've been at SMU for about 20 years now. Philosophy takes up more time than I'd probably even like it to take, but it's kind of what I enjoy doing. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, and we're going to talk about epistemology today. You and I discussed the topic. It's one of my favorite topics. I don't know a lot about it, but I'm very excited to talk about Descartes and Hume and Berkeley and Kant, who I've always had a great fascination with. And let me just read a little bit of your bio information from the SMU website. And I'm just going to kind of define a few terms. I'm sure a lot of people that are watching right now don't know what a lot of this is, and see if we can talk about it. You said, "My work mostly concerns the nature of subjectivity, the self, and the mind." So when you talk about the nature of subjectivity, what does that mean?
Well, so sometimes when people study the mind, they study it sort of from what you might say is a third-person perspective. They study, where do, beliefs get stored and how do they get stored, or how does visual processing work, or things like that. I'm interested in sort of what makes us sort of subjects in the world, what makes us, people having a perspective on the world, what makes us conscious, to what degree does it make sense to say we have selves, and if so, what are those things? And so when I am interested in subjectivity, I'm really interested in all the sort of things that sort of make us who we are.
Mm-hmm. As like how we would differ from a dog or a giraffe, or that kind of thing?
Some of the things are, in common. I take it that those things are conscious, and I'm very interested in like what makes something conscious, and is consciousness the same thing as a brain state, or is it distinct from a brain state? But I am interested in some of the things that might make us distinct. So, for example, I'm interested in things like free will. I'm interested in things like being able to sort of reflect and know ourselves, which is probably something that giraffes don't do a lot about. So those are some of the things.
Yeah. It says, "As a result, I wind up working in metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language." All right. So metaphysics, that's a big word that clearly is very important. I always think of Aristotle when I think of metaphysics. What is metaphysics exactly?
Well, it's a little tricky. When you go to the bookstore, you typically see metaphysics, associated with like crystals and dream catchers and that sort of thing, and that's not really what we do. Metaphysics is interested in the broadest sense in sort of the nature of the world. And so here's some questions. It'd be easier to just talk about some questions. So metaphysics would be interested in, the existence of God, for example. But metaphysics would also be interested in what is causation? What is it for one thing to cause another? If you believe that the entire world is made of just purely physical stuff, that's a metaphysical view. It's a view about the nature of the world. Mm-hmm. If you think that the world has a lot of spiritual stuff in it, that's a metaphysical view. And so metaphysics is sort of the most general study of sort of what composes our world.
Okay. Epistemology, that's what the main topic is going to be. We might as well go ahead and define that. I always think of the study of knowledge. Would that be a good definition, or how would you describe epistemology and why it matters?
Yeah, I think that the study of knowledge is one way to put it. Of course, when you say that, you might think you're studying things that we know. And of course, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like what knowledge is, what makes something knowledge. So one way to think about epistemology is to think about it sort of in relation to ethics, which people have a better sense of. Ethics is sort of about what makes an action good. Epistemology in some ways is about what makes a belief good. So what is the goal of belief? Is it achievable? How can we achieve it? And knowledge is typically considered to be kind of the good that we're aiming for with belief. And so epistemology is sort of about that good and how it is attainable or not attainable in various ways.
And when you say good, do you mean like from a ethical standpoint, like it's good knowledge, or are you saying just good as in something where like the will is drawn to? Well, what do you mean by good?
I mean it's sort of the goal of belief. So the idea is that when we're believing, you can believe something just because of the fact that it's sort of let's say ethically good. But in general, when we say that's, when we're talking about epistemology, we're talking about the good having to do with truth. Like it's in some ways approaching truth, and in some ways that we may talk about even better than truth in some ways. So it's just the aim as opposed to the moral good.
Mm-hmm. And then why, of all the different topics of philosophy that you could have latched on to, what was it about this particular area? Because clearly epistemology, consciousness, knowledge, this is something that you have a particular interest in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of my work has been in philosophy of mind recently, but epistemology was my probably first interest. And it was all basically started from reading Descartes. And Descartes sort of presents us with a puzzle, which we can talk some more about. It makes it look as though a lot of the things we think that we know, maybe we don't know after all. Yeah. And when you kind of get a challenge like that, at least I have this irresistible itch to try to resolve it. And so that's what kind of has driven me towards epistemology, is the attempt to kind of figure out, how to resolve that itch.
Yeah. I'm going to use this as our example, because when we talk about coming to know something, I think therefore I am, and I know Descartes was trying to solve this problem of like absolute, what he can know for certain, right? You brought him up, and I did a little research before we started. He died in 1650, so mostly lived in the 17th century. And Rene Descartes, Frenchman, Catholic as I recall, believer. I think therefore I am. That's what he's best known for. I know he did a whole lot more than that. You talk about the problem, the skeptical problem. What's the problem, and does it have to do with I think therefore I am? Is that what it comes back to?
So yeah, it's related. So let me just kind of start by talking about sort of where he got to where he was, because even though we're going to be talking about Descartes, this is really in a lot of ways the kickoff for epistemology that lasts to this day. And Descartes starts the Meditations, which is his most famous work, by basically saying, look, I've waited all my life for a time when I can just reflect on what I know and sort of sort it out and distinguish the good from the bad. And he recognizes that a lot of the things that are beliefs that he's sort of inherited don't really work out. Some do. And so what he wants to do, he says, is he wants to essentially come up with a way to make sure that his beliefs are good. Yeah. Try to get rid of the bad ones, keep the good ones. And he wants to come up with a method by which he can sort of ensure that the beliefs he has are good ones, as opposed to just, rumors or things passed down by his mom that weren't, don't have any substance to them. And so the trick of the Meditations is to figure out how he can do that. And so what he does is he starts off by what you might call the method of doubt. He says, well, so what sorts of things can I doubt, and how can I resolve those doubts? Because a good sign for something's being knowledge, for something that I can actually sort of own and say I know, is if I can resolve doubts about it.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happens pretty early in the meditations is he says, well, it certainly seems like I'm sitting here at a table or sitting here in front of a fireplace, I think he said, and I'm perceiving it, and it seems like it's a warm fireplace. But then he says, but there's been lots of times when I've actually dreamt that occurred. There's times when I thought that I was sitting by my fireplace, but as a matter of fact, I was just dreaming it. So how do I know that I'm not dreaming now? And what's even worse, he says maybe even worse would be, how do I know that, I believe in God, he says, but like, how do I know that there's not like an evil demon that's actually causing me to believe all these things, and that I'm not really sitting by the fireplace, but I'm actually just experiencing some sort of massive dream given to me by an evil demon? And so he tries to resolve that, and it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But what's underlying this is this idea that basically in order to know something, you need to be able to rule out a conflicting hypothesis with it, right? And so if there's a conflicting hypothesis that looks like it accommodates the same data or the same evidence, then it looks like you either have to sort of be neutral between the conflicting hypothesis and what you believe, or you need to find some way to rule out the conflicting hypothesis. And the puzzle that we inherit from Descartes is it looks like there's not really a whole lot of evidence that we have that can rule out the possibility that we're dreaming at a particular moment, or that we're being fooled by an evil demon, or for people who have seen The Matrix, to rule out the possibility that we're in The Matrix, because everything would seem the same. And it looks like all the evidence that I would have to sort of adduce against that could be replicated within the scenario. And so sort of the Cartesian puzzle is essentially that it looks like a ton of our evidence for things that we believe, like that I'm sitting here talking to you, that I take to be really good evidence, is actually consistent with something wildly different. And so why am I justified in believing what I do?
And that would be the skepticism, right?
That would be so if you chose the skeptical result, you would say, I just don't know.
Yeah.
But the goal of epistemology is to try to vindicate that knowledge and try to say, no, actually, I think we do know these things, but how?
Would he be kind of rebelling, I guess, for lack of a better word, from the Aristotelian Thomistic kind of, which was the go-to philosophy when he lived, right? I mean, that was the gold standard. And was he rejecting that in a sense and saying, I don't think that's the right model? Or because he's really the father of modern philosophy, whereas maybe medieval philosophy would have been more Aristotelian Thomistic, right? Did it kind of turn all that in its head? Was that his intention?
Well, I don't know whether that was his intention or not. I do know that I think that as he was alive, a lot of things that we had taken to be true, he felt like science was showing wasn't true, and science was undergoing a revolution during this time. And I think that he saw himself as being part of that, and because of the fact that he inherited all this from, let's say, Aristotle, and for centuries, basically, it was enough to say that it was true to say Aristotle said it. I mean, it was kind of taken as faith that if Aristotle said it, it's got to be right.
Yeah.
And Descartes wasn't interested in that. He was interested in, okay, let's see if I can't establish, in the same way that I established the truth of geometry, which he did in a fairly impressive way, let's try to establish other things.
And, sometimes I think like a 5-year-old, there's a certain commonsensical part of us that just knows that there's a cup in front of me or a pen. And when they read something like this, they're thinking, wow, that really sounds bizarre, that you can't rely on maybe your senses. Or I understand that you could have had a dream and, like that kind of thing. Does his philosophy hold water for you? I mean, do you think, does it make sense? Or
Well, it's not that he believed, he didn't think you didn't know that there was a water cup here. He actually did think you knew that, as do I. It's more of a puzzle. So the trick is, okay, so what do we mean by knowing something, right? Like what does it take to know something? And it looks as though here's something that we don't think is the case. It's not enough to know something that you just happen to be right. So let's say that I don't know whether Davy Crockett fought at the Alamo or the Battle of the Bulge. And I flip a coin, and I say, if it's heads, I'll believe he fought at the Alamo. And it's heads. And so I'm like, Davy Crockett fought at the Alamo. Well, I don't know he fought at the Alamo. I believe it, and it's true, but like there's something shoddy about that belief, right? I don't have very good evidence, and so it's natural to say, okay, so a belief needs to not only be true, but it also needs to have evidence behind it. And then the natural question is like, how much evidence? What sort of evidence? And I think Descartes had an idea that was something like this. Let's suppose you look outside the window and you see a yellow bird. And you say, there's a goldfinch out there. And I say, oh, really? How do you know it's a goldfinch? It could be a canary. And you say, well, it's a yellow bird. And I say, well, canaries are yellow too. And you say, oh, I don't even know what canaries are. And I certainly don't know how I would tell the difference between canaries and a goldfinch. So maybe I don't know it's a goldfinch after all, right? Maybe it's a canary. And so the idea is that the reason you don't know it's a goldfinch is because you don't have enough evidence to rule out that it's a canary, right? And this doesn't sound like that crazy. This sounds actually something that we all should believe, right? You should have enough evidence to be able to rule out, other possibilities. And what Descartes is saying is that here's a other possibility that it looks like doesn't meet that standard, namely that we're in a dream or that we're being fooled by an evil demon. So there's this very simple goldfinch standard, which looks like we all buy into. And his thing is like, well, if you do, then it looks like you don't know that you're sitting here because you could be in the Matrix or you could be dreaming. Now that, of course, sounds crazy. So then the trick is, well, what do? Do you reject the goldfinch standard? Or do you come up with some other story about how we know we're sitting here?
Yeah.
And that's what he tries to do.
And at the time when he wrote this and he came up with I think there are 4 a.m. and his method, this was pretty revolutionary, right? Was it immediately like a big deal in the philosophical world? Because he really spawned a lot of thought, didn't he? The empiricists would come along, and then he would be considered a rational philosopher, right?
Yeah. So I have to say, like, I'm not that big of a fan of the rationalist empiricist distinction because I think almost everybody believes that there's a rationalist part and an empiricist part. But yeah, he would be traditionally considered a rationalist, which I think tends to mean to people that he believed that you could come at truths just by thinking about them, right? Yeah. That the mind could get you at truths. But he too, I think, thought that sense and experience was really important. So. Yeah. It was really revolutionary. He actually passed out these meditations to what he thought were the smartest people of the day before he even published them, and asked for them to respond to him. And they all wrote responses, and then he wrote responses to them and published them all together. Very kind of intellectually responsible. Let's just see if somebody can get me, and then I'll publish my responses. And yeah, I think that basically, whether he knew it or not, he ushered in a revolution that in many ways hasn't kind of abated.
So then the empiricists came along afterwards. I know we're going to talk about David Hume and George Berkeley. Hume was Scottish, Berkeley Irish, so they both come from Europe and lived in the 18th century. Did Berkeley precede Hume or the other way around? Or they were contemporaries, right? Didn't they live around? I think they died within about 20 years of each other. I
think that people typically think of Berkeley as preceding Hume in sort of thought. In that basically, even though Hume wrote his most important work when he was extraordinarily young. He was in his very early 20s, I believe.
Oh, really?
And Berkeley was much older, but in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people feel like sort of Hume is sort of the next step after Berkeley. Once you go to Berkeley, then then Hume presents this sort of next challenge.
Kind of built upon each other. Yeah.
Well, so Berkeley, Berkeley was in some ways less of an epistemologist than he was a metaphysician, and what I mean by that is, so there's actually two ways that you could actually respond to Descartes' puzzle, right? There's more than two, but the main two are, one is you could actually say, oh, look, we have a lot more knowledge of the physical world out there than we thought, and here's how that works, right? Another option is to say, no, actually, Descartes was right, but the answer is to say that the things that we're sort of in contact with aren't really physical things after all. If everything was a dream, or let's say that this whole world was set up by an evil demon, that's just what tables would be, right, in that world. We'd still be seeing tables. It's just that tables aren't really physical things after all. They're actually just things in our head, right? So if Descartes' right, then basically it's possible that, this whole thing's a dream, therefore kind of in your head in a way. Berkeley could be seen as saying, we can't even make sense of the idea, once you think about it, of there being anything outside of ideas or outside of our heads. So he's known as an idealist, which is in some ways like the opposite of a materialist. If a materialist believes that everything in the world is made out of the material stuff that physics talks about, an idealist says actually everything's sort of made of ideas. And so Berkeley's kind of response to the Cartesian puzzle wasn't to say there is physical stuff and we know it. It's to say, no, actually we do know what a table is, but it turns out that it's just something in our minds. Or in Berkeley's case, it's in the mind of God.
So like denying the possibility that this thing actually has matter and it's just an idea.
Right.
Just and that seems bizarre to most people.
It seems totally bizarre. I mean, but basically, Berkeley sort of takes you through this thought process where he says, look, if you really think about it, the things that you know about things are the way in which it sort of makes you feel, right? So think about the feeling of heat. Well, you have a certain feeling in your hand, right? You think you're feeling in your hand. And that feeling is how you know that there's something hot out there, right? It's something internal that's sort of telling you about the external world. And he thinks you can see the same thing with respect to colors and with respect to the surfaces of objects, that they all essentially depend upon our sort of sensing them. And once you accept that, you can ask the question, well, what grasp of them do we have beyond those features of them, beyond our sensing of them? And he says we don't really. All we really have grasp of is the way that they affect our minds. And so why say that there's anything else but that stuff?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Berkeley.
Yeah.
And then Hume comes along and he even takes it a step further. Would he be considered an idealist also to like the extreme or... so idealist would be from the word idea, right? Where things are just ideas in our mind. Is that where idealism comes from?
Yeah.
Because I always thought it meant, like
being idealistic.
Yeah, they're like perfectionists. But
No.
you just talk is like, and sorry to, but is that going back to Plato's ideas or that kind of thing?
So of course, depending on how you read Plato, you could read Plato's ideas as being like the forms, which are outside the head. Those are actually something that exists independently of us. The ideas that these guys have in mind, of course, are basically mental states, things in our minds.
Yeah.
And so, that's the sense of ideas they have in mind and why they're considered idealists.
Yeah. So going back to my pen, I said I was going to use this a couple of times.
Yeah.
So something like Berkeley, he'd say the pen is there, but it's in my mind, and I really can't prove any kind of physical aspect of it, or what would he say if he was sitting here as far as my knowledge of this pen?
Well, what he'd probably do is he'd probably take you through the various aspects of the pen, and he'd say, well, which ones do you have evidence of existing independent of you? And you might say, well, what about the shape? And he says, well, how do you know the shape? Well, I feel it. And you say, well, okay, well, that's a feeling. How do you know that feeling refers to something? And there's something causing you to feel it. And that's a little hard. You say, I'm not sure. Well, I see it. And he says, well, the seeing, that's an impression it makes on you too. What else do you have to tell you that actually there's something other than that feeling it gives you? And he'll say that you're going to go through all the features of the pen, and you're going to come up with nothing except for the way it affects you, essentially. And so he says, why think there's anything more to it than that?
Okay.
Right? If you don't have any grasp of there being something more than that, and you can't prove there being something more than that, then why not just say that's what the pen is?
Okay.
It's basically just a way of affecting our minds.
Yeah, interesting. Does this all go back to the subjectivism that we talked about at the beginning, which you have, the nature of subjectivity as the subject in relation to things that we experience? Is that connected to all this?
Well, that goes back to Descartes too. So, I think, therefore I am. People sometimes think that when they hear that, they think he's saying something like, I think, therefore, the essence of myself is a thinking thing. And he does actually think your essence is a thinking thing, but it can be confusing because you sometimes see, like, on people's bumper stickers, things like, I golf, therefore I am, or something like that, right? And they're saying, like, golf is the most important thing to me, or something.
Yeah.
And that's not really what Descartes was up to. Descartes was basically saying, look, I've got this problem here. It looks like I can doubt everything. Like, it looks like an evil demon could be fooling me about everything. And so is there anything that I can know? And he thinks, yeah, actually, there's one thing I can know. I can know that I'm thinking. How can I know that? Well, because even if I'm being fooled by an evil demon, only things that are thinking can be fooled.
Yeah.
Right? And in order to be thinking, I have to exist. So I can prove I'm thinking, and I can prove I exist based upon that. And so for Descartes, that was sort of the fulcrum, the starting point of his knowledge. He said, okay, I've got a piece of knowledge now. Now let's work up from there. Mm-hmm. And working up from there is tough. But I think therefore I am is like this idea that the one thing you can grasp sort of beyond any doubt is that you exist and that you're thinking.
Yeah.
So my interest in subjectivity, one way to kind of put it is that I think it's really interesting, the idea that basically the thing that we have the biggest grasp of, at least according to Descartes, and I tend to agree with him, is our own minds.
Yeah.
So what does that say about our own minds? Does that mean that it's a different sort of thing than the rest of the world? Does it mean that basically there's a certain contact we have with our own minds that we don't have with anything else? What does it mean? What does it mean, for example, that I can doubt that I even have a body because perhaps I'm being fooled by the evil demon that I have a body, but I can't doubt that I have a mind? What does that tell me that is about what is most intimately me?
Yeah.
And I think Descartes thinks, and I'm inclined to agree, that actually suggests that basically sort of something mental is what's sort of most intimately me, at least. That's what I most intimately know about myself.
A lot of people think, philosophers are way up in this level and it doesn't have any really significance to my daily life and going to the grocery store and raising kids. Would you agree? Does this kind of conversation apply to the average person, apply to events in the world and, the daily grind, so to speak? And how so? How I guess if somebody were to say, why does this matter to the average person? What would you say?
Well, one thing, so this puzzle is a puzzle that arises, and the puzzle sounds really out there. But the puzzle really kind of stemmed from something that was very intuitive. The idea that you didn't know it was a goldfinch because of the fact you didn't know it was a canary. And it looks like we are often in a position where we have these beliefs, and we want to know basically, okay, what sort of standards do we have to meet for me to be happy with this belief as a piece of knowledge? We're now in a position where there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. There's a lot of people believing stuff that, doesn't look like it has the right sort of evidence. And we believe things based upon the news programs that we watch. And perhaps you watch a channel that I don't watch, and for vice versa. And as a result, we have these totally different sources of information. Well, epistemology is in part, and this Cartesian puzzle is in part about, given this sort of situation where we're bombarded with information and where we have people who have beliefs that look like they're unhinged from reality, as a responsible believer, what standards do I hold myself to when I form beliefs? I think I should have evidence. Well, what should that evidence look like? It looks like I should be able to rule out some possibilities, but maybe some possibilities I can just kind of rule out as crazy. Which ones are those? So the general sort of philosophical puzzle probably doesn't immediately have a whole lot of impact. It's more of an intellectual puzzle. But the sort of reason why we're concerned about the puzzle is that we're concerned about very everyday things. Like, for example, do we have enough evidence to believe in God? Mm-hmm. Do we have enough evidence to believe that the election was legitimate? Do we have enough evidence to believe that, there is a pedophile ring in, the Democratic Party? People believe all these things, and all these different beliefs probably have a different status. And I think that philosophers say we should reflect upon those beliefs and say, okay, what sort of evidence do we have for them? How much do we need? And epistemology is kind of the study of that. And the Cartesian puzzle is just a way of showing like how difficult that question can be. Yeah. But it has, I think, fairly direct application. And so,
Now, knowledge is an interesting thing. Not that I have to convince you of that, but there's so much we believe based on trust, that George Washington lived, that that there's a place called China overseas, which I've never been to. I've seen some pictures of. People sometimes say, "Did we actually ever land on the moon, or was that all that kind of thing?" Right? And we take that basically on the trust of somebody and maybe some pictures, but that's why this kind of thing, if nothing else, it makes you think about thinking, right? It makes you think about knowledge and what we believe. And that's very practical.
That's right. I mean, I think so. One of the questions about knowledge is, to what degree should we rely upon testimony from others? And, given that others can deceive us, what are the conditions under which we can be justified in relying on testimony? And we better be justified in relying on it because, like you say, almost everything that we believe kind of stems from people telling us stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Probably 90% of what we believe, right?
Tons. Yeah, it's got to be something like that. And so if it turns out that basically we can't trust any of that, then we're in pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
So a very popular topic in philosophy right now, for example, is talking about like under what conditions is testimony a good source of knowledge and what conditions under which it isn't. And so when I teach my students, I try not only to kind of bring to bear these kind of abstract puzzles, but also to kind of bring them back to say, okay, well, why do you believe this as opposed to that? And what sort of reasons do you have? And what sorts of research could you do to actually get a better belief? And do you have an obligation to do that work?
Yeah, I want to get to Kant because he's one. For some reason, I feel very drawn to Kant, and I know very little about him. And I know that you have a lot of knowledge of him. Before we get to him, we didn't really talk much about Hume, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on him because Berkeley you discussed a lot, and I know they're both empiricists. My understanding is that Kant was trying to find a solution, basically between the rationalists and the empiricists, and kind of, I don't know. That's my understanding. Tell me if I'm wrong about that. And let's merge our way into Kant. But is there anything in particular that we should know about Hume before we get to Kant?
Yeah. So one way to think about Hume is, Hume thinks that basically we can't possibly have any knowledge or any ideas that aren't directly derived from sense experience. So, how do I have the notion of, a solidity? Well, it comes from my having had the sensation of touching this table's edge or something like that. And so I can directly trace my notion of solidity to something that I've experienced. And Hume says, okay, good, let's do that with everything. And it turns out that's pretty hard, right? Think about the notion of God. That's hard to trace back to a sense experience, right? The notion of goodness, right? That's hard to trace back to a sense experience. And then there's some things that look like that, everybody should agree on, that there's things like one thing causes another. And he says, well, where do you see causation? Where's that sense impression? Where does that come from? And basically, Hume said, if you really look at it, there's just an awful lot that doesn't stem from sense experience. And so his response is to say, either it doesn't really exist or we don't know about it, or to say that essentially, our ideas are deeply confused about it.
Yeah. Is he the one that said if you go into a closet and you see a shirt hanging on a hanger, and then you close the door, since it's no longer in your direct sense experience at that moment, it no longer exists? Have you heard that? Or
I don't know whether he would say that exactly.
Because it's no longer in my immediate sense experience.
Yeah,
right?
I do think that. I'm not exactly sure whether he would say that or not. There's certainly some suggestions that he would say things like that because it's not your sense experience. He'd say that, given that all you really know are sensory things, that's all the shirt really is. Yeah. And so if there's no sensing happening in the closet, then there's no shirt in the closet. Right? Basically one way to kind of put Hume's sort of, dead end in some ways is to say it looks like if you kind of trace everything back to sense experience, it looks very difficult to get a good conception of almost anything. Mm-hmm. And so one way to kind of see Kant as responding to that is Kant, famously said something along the lines of, Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumber. And what people take him to mean by that is that he realized, well, boy, it looks like, sense experience can't be the source of an awful lot of our notions. So where does it come from? And, one way to put Kant's not easy, I got to tell you, but one way to kind of put the general picture behind Kant is to say that that a lot of what we know about the world is actually imposed upon it by our minds. So he's like Berkeley in that he thinks that basically a lot of things are sort of ideal. In fact, he is an idealist of sorts. But where he responds to Hume is essentially saying things like, it's actually just the particular way in which our minds filter reality that makes it the case that, for example, certain geometrical truths hold of reality, or that causation is true, or that they're solid objects. It's essentially that, the world isn't just some flurry of sense experience. It's structured in a particular way, and it's structured by our minds, which impose upon a sort of set of rules upon it. And part of the job of science and philosophy is to actually find out what those rules are. So he kind of agreed with Hume in a way, in that he thought, look, it looks like we better figure out some way that we know a lot of things about solidity or space and time or causation or things like that. And if Hume's right, we can't. And so what Kant says, no, we can, but it's actually, sort of rules that our minds impose upon reality, as opposed to the way reality is in itself.
Yeah. And he either coined the phrase Copernican Revolution in philosophy, or somebody else said that about him, obviously referring to Copernicus and the Earth revolving around the sun and not vice versa. Was that his own terminology, and what did he mean by that?
I don't know whether it was his own terminology or not, frankly. What I think people typically mean by the Copernican Revolution in philosophy is that, as opposed to believing that, so the Copernican Revolution is a story about, sort of what is the center of things? Right? Is it the Earth or the sun? And you can see Kant is saying, okay, what's the center of things? And it turns out that the center of things is actually the mind, as opposed to the things out there. And so what we're really interested in studying are the features of the mind. And that's a big flip from those who think that basically our job is to study the things out there.
That's a big difference.
It's a huge difference.
So if and tell me if this is too simplistic, but the truth of this pen, one might say, exists in the pen, and then my job is to discover that truth, whereas Kant might say, well, no, the mind already has a category that it imposes upon the pen. Does that sound right?
Yeah, something like that. Is that essentially, I think Kant thinks that we don't really have any grasp of the way that the world is sort of outside of our mind's way of parsing out the world. Our mind carves up the world in certain ways. And one way to think about it is in relation to Aristotle, for example. Aristotle has these categories, this famous book, The Categories, that basically list all the different sort of ways in which the world can be. And this is the way the world is, right? This is the nature of objects. Kant says, he doesn't take Aristotle exactly like this, but he says, I agree with that sort of idea, except that's the way we carve things up. It's not the way things are in themselves. Who knows about that? But it's the way that we naturally carve things up. So we carve things up as being in space and time. We carve things up as, basically being solid versus being not solid, and being in past and future and things like that. But that's all just a matter of how we carve things up. And Kant thinks that's actually a good thing, because that puts it within our reach to understand. If basically it's outside of us, he thinks, what are our hopes of really gaining an understanding of it?
Yeah.
And so he distinguishes between the sort of the phenomenal world, which is the world that we can see and touch and feel, and basically that is already sort of processed by the mind, and the noumenal world, which is basically what's behind that. And he denies that we can come to any understanding of that.
Yeah. Aquinas talks about the passive intellect, which I understand to be kind of the potential to know all things, that we can know anything that within our nature to know, but then it has to be kind of tapped by the active intellect. And so I see where it's the revolution. It's just totally different because it's originating from self. It's not a discovery of the world. It's just imposing those things which were already kind of innate, right?
Yep.
And I'm just kind of thinking out loud and trying to get it's a fascinating thing. You talk about in the notes that you sent me real progress in the 20th century. That was last century. What happened in all this?
Well,
and
so in epistemology, I actually think that this is an area where real activities happened, and people are going to debate about whether or not it really solved the puzzles. But one of the things that sort of happened in about the middle of the 20th century was a shift away from thinking about what can I prove about the world, where that's what epistemologists since Descartes were worried about. Like, what can I prove? How can I prove that there's a table here? And there's a shift more to say, well, maybe knowledge doesn't work like that. Maybe we get knowledge just by getting the information, right? So let's just kind of step back and, like, how does a dog, we want to say a dog knows that its bowl's in front of it. Can a dog do Descartes' proofs? No, that's ridiculous. But a dog knows that there's a bowl there. Well, how does it know it's a bowl there? Well, he has, sense impressions, and he has beliefs that are caused by the bowl and that are there when the bowl's there and not there when the bowl is not there. And so there's this sort of reliable stream of information from the bowl to the dog. And so epistemology in the 20th century, at least a lot of epistemologists, began to actually think in terms of that stream of information and say, let's think less about sort of the proofs that we can do to prove whether or not there's, external world or this sort of thing. And let's instead think that maybe knowledge has more to do with the flow of information. And to know that there's a table here is basically just to sort of have sort of beliefs and internal states that are like reliably caused by tables. And that's just like the dog, when they knows there's a bowl there, isn't doing a whole lot of complicated proving, nor are we, right? Mm-hmm. We're just basically receiving the information, but we still know because it's actually reliably caused by the stuff out there.
Is that to say that our experience of the bowl is not that much different than the dog, or that
it probably differs in certain ways, and certain people like my mentor Rene Souza think that we can actually recapture a lot of what Descartes wants, and by saying, like, there's a sort of a level of our knowledge that's like the dog's, and then there's sort of another level that involves our understanding, the nature of our own senses and what caused it and why is the bowl there sometimes and not others. And there's all sorts of reasoning that we add layer upon it, which is really important. But I think that a lot of people in the 20th century felt like you better start with something like what the dog has, which is basically just having beliefs and stuff caused by bowls. And that's what gives you knowledge first and foremost, is that sort of foundation of a connection to the world, rather than some sort of airy proof.
Because Aristotle talked about a sensitive soul, a rational soul, a vegetative soul. Is it that much far removed from what Aristotle was saying 400 years BC, or is there a big difference in what people are talking about today?
Well, so my like I said, Rene Souza, my mentor, who I think is considered one of the best epistemologists living, and one of the people who sort of ushered in this revolution. He takes Aristotle, in particular his Nicomachean Ethics, to be sort of his guiding light. Because Aristotle's, it wasn't clear what his epistemology was exactly. There's some speculation, but like he doesn't talk a lot about what's knowledge and what's not knowledge. And so, but Souza thinks that actually you can find sort of seeds of this in Aristotle, and that it's not that different, and that basically it wasn't until we got to Descartes that things got all sort of intellectualized. But that we actually should recognize that, there's an intellectual part to our knowledge, but a lot of it's just about being riveted by our sense organs to the world.
All right. Well, I think riveted is a good way to close out this interview here. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Dr. Robert Howell, Chair of the Department of Philosophy at Southern Methodist University, and a very interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was good talking to you.